So how long can you neglect a small engine like a leaf blower? 1 year, a couple of years, how about a dozen years? Surprisingly, this one was neglected for well over several years and it's been working well all this time, except now. Time has finally caught up with this one and now it has some very serious issues that pretty much makes it useless other than a doorstop. So hopefully we can get it working again, otherwise this one is going to disappear into the trash. In today's video, we're going to look at this Ryobi branded leaf blower, and the problem is that it starts but it won't stay running long enough to do any real work. Now I'm quite surprised just how long this one lasted with the way it was treated, but eventually things will catch up with you just like this one. Now I'm going to try and repair this leaf blower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you like in the video, please ask about it and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now this blower belongs to a good friend of mine who I've known for a very long time. They reached out to me to ask if I could take a look at it because it's having some running issues. Now I did ask them the basic questions, and to be quite honest, I didn't think it was going to be a tough job, but here in a minute I'm going to prove myself wrong. So the plan is to take the simple approach by adjusting the carb and seeing if it gets any better, but that doesn't end up going quite the way I was hoping. After talking to them, I did find out quite a lot of information, and the most surprising one was that this blower was bought over 9 years ago brand new, but that's not all. Turns out they don't do any sort of prep work, not even for winter. So take that to your local overpriced steel dealer. Now the blower did come with a full tank of fuel, so that'll help us figure out if the fuel might be the issue it's having. So I've said it before, but I do not like this color of two-stroke oil. The reason is because it's hard to tell if there's any issue with it. I find that any other color to be a lot better in figuring out if there might be an issue with the fuel. The next step is to try and start it and see the issue it's having. As you just saw, it started and ran like it's supposed to while choked, but when the choke lever was moved to the half position, it didn't want to stay running. I do believe the engine is running out of fuel, so to test out this theory for the next test, I'm going to move the lever between the full and the half choke position. If it stays running, then the carb isn't able to deliver enough fuel to the engine, which means we'll need to inspect the entire fuel system for any issues. So what you just saw was that the engine didn't have any issues while barely choked, but as soon as I moved the lever to the half position, it did the exact same thing as before and soon stopped. So we can try to adjust the carb to deliver more fuel to the engine and see if it'll make any difference. Now since it's having an issue at idle speeds, I'm going to make adjustments to the L screw. Now to start off, I'm going to turn it counterclockwise a quarter turn. Now the other screw is the H screw, but we won't touch that one until we get the engine running first. And if we can get it to run better, maybe we won't have to dig into the entire fuel system. So there was a slight improvement. It ran just a little bit longer than before the adjustment. Now even though it was better, it didn't make enough of a difference as I was hoping for, so I think it would be best to look into the fuel system for any issues. We're basically going to inspect the carb all the way down to the fuel tank, looking for any issues that might cause the carb to not be able to deliver enough fuel to the engine. But before we do that, I'm going to give it a once over and get rid of any dirt that could get into the carb, the fuel tank, or into the engine. The next item I want to check is the fuel that came with the blower. I want to make sure it's not stale or has any water in it. Now the owner assures me that the fuel is only about 2 weeks old, but after getting the fuel into a glass jar, it's difficult to tell by the color just how old it is. But I do believe it's not stale. However, I did find about half an ounce of water at the bottom of the jar. Now it's not enough to cause our issues, but I do have to wonder where they're getting their fuel from. The next item I want to look at are the fuel lines, and that's when I realized just how close they were to losing their blower. The fuel line has started to break down and the outer part has cracked. That means if the line had broken completely or collapsed, it could have caused the engine to lean out on fuel and damage the top part of the engine. Fortunately, it didn't get that bad. Also, you can see that the part of the fuel line that's not submerged in the fuel looks to be in great shape, and I'll explain why. Now, these fuel lines are not what I would call durable. Even though they're designed to move fuel, they will eventually break down. That means the more contact with gasoline, the more it's going to break down. My recommendation is to limit the time fuel has contact with the lines. And if all possible, I would keep the fuel tank empty of any fuel between uses during the mowing season. I know that sounds rather idiotic, but it's just an idea. I never said it would make sense. Now, after getting the pumping section off the carb, I soon realized what half of the issue might have been. As you can see, it looks like there's a blob of something blocking the inlet screen. This would drastically reduce the amount of fuel that can enter the carb and of course reduce the fuel leaving the carb. Now I could just pick this blob off the screen, but I'd rather take the carb apart and clean it with some carb cleaner instead. This of course means we'll need to remove the metering diaphragm and inspect it as well. Now this diaphragm is stuck to the metal plate that covers it, but after taking it off, it doesn't feel as soft and as pliable as it should be. Now after putting it back on the carb, we can get a better idea of just how flexible it really is, and if I had to rate this diaphragm, I'd say it was just okay. Now you could reuse it again, but since I have a replacement with me, I'm going to do just that. Once the diaphragm is out of the way, I'll then remove the needle and rocker arm assembly from the carb. After that, I'll then carefully spray carb cleaner into the screen to try to loosen the debris. Now after it's gone, I'll then watch to see if the cleaner will disappear through the screen. Once that happens, I'll then start to reassemble the carb. Now I didn't take the fuel screws out for a good reason. If I think it needs it, I'll then take them out, but for this one, I didn't feel as though it was necessary. Also, be extremely careful when putting these tiny parts back into the carb. The reason is these are so easy to lose, and if you do lose them, well, it's almost not worth the time or the effort to try and find them. If you do lose one of these tiny parts, just order a new carb. If you want to, you can get an OEM quality carb, but that's up to you. But on this particular brand, it really doesn't matter. Now, after checking that the rocker arm is moving like it should, I'll then replace the gasket, followed by the new metering diaphragm. Now, I buy these in multi-packs of 10 or 20, which makes each one very inexpensive. However, if you had to buy just one, it'd be around $5 to $7 a piece. Now the same goes for the purge bulbs. I'll buy a pack of 50 to 100 and that makes each one very inexpensive. Of course, I don't expect you to buy that many, but to make it cheaper, I'd find one other person you know who might go in on a purchase with you, and if they agree to buy a couple as well, you could end up with a pack of 5 for the same amount you were going to buy a single for. Now after getting the carb back together, I'll then start to replace the fuel lines by taking out the old ones. Now years ago, I didn't have a pair of these bent long nose pliers, and to be honest, doing fuel lines without them was a real pain, but after getting these, they aren't as difficult as they used to be. Now you can find these at any parts store or in the tools section of a large box store. Now to help get the lines into the openings for the tank, I would cut them at a steep angle. I would resist the urge to try to make the openings any bigger to make it easier to push the lines into the tank. Most often the lines will leak at the tank if you try this out, so don't even bother trying, otherwise you could be in big trouble. Now, you can keep the same orientation as to which opening is the filter line and which one is the return line, but to be quite honest, it really doesn't matter. I'm also going to change the filter with one that I already have on hand. The reason is because I'm not sure if the original one has any debris inside it that could clog the screen again. Until I can clean it out, I'll just put it away and use a different one. Now this filter looks substantial, but there are better ones on the market that'll work a lot better. The same applies here as before. Buy more than one and you'll get a better deal. Also, make sure there's enough fuel line in the tank that the filter can reach the bottom of the tank. Now, I'm not installing the carb just yet. Instead, I'm just getting an idea of where to cut the fuel lines at. Of course, you can make the fuel lines as long as you want, but it would look kind of silly to have the lines that were much too long. When connecting the fuel lines, the filter line will connect to the port furthest away from the bulb, and the return line will connect to the port closer to the bulb. After installing the carb back onto the engine, we'll then put some fuel into the tank. That way we can do a flow test for the lines. Now, if the lines get switched on the carb, the engine will still start and run, but the carb will get clogged with debris since the line it's pulling fuel with won't have a filter on it, so this is very important. I'm also going to do something that most people might not do, and that's to put the fuel I took out of it back into it. The reason is because this fuel represents the mixture they made and not my own. That means if I need to tune the carb, it's going to be on their fuel, which might not be the same as mine. Now, you don't have to agree with me, but I'm fine if you don't. Now, when pressing the bulb, fuel should come up the filter line, go through the carb into the bulb, and then out the return line and back to the tank. Now it took several presses, but there's now fuel partially filling the bulb and going back to the tank. If yours isn't doing this, there might be an issue with the carb, and you can either take it back apart or better yet, just order a brand new carb. Now at this point, there's nothing left to do but to start it and see what it does. So it looks like after getting it started, it stayed running instead of stopping like it did before. After that, we then needed to turn the L screw counterclockwise a few turns until it stopped stumbling when squeezing the trigger. After that, I then tuned the H screw by holding the trigger down and finding when the engine speed was the highest. I then turned it just a bit more to give it more fuel, which should keep the engine from overheating and making it last longer. Basically, the engine was starving for fuel because of a partial blockage on the inlet screen, probably caused by the fuel line coming apart. The metering diaphragm was showing only a slight sign of hardening, so it was also replaced along with the fuel lines. So for only a couple of dollars, we were able to get this blower up and running again, which is a lot cheaper than having to replace it. In the future, I would ask them to not leave fuel in it during the winter months, but to be quite honest, it seems that whatever they were doing before worked out great for them, and 8+ years with this blower is not bad at all, even if it's not priced like a blower that costs 3 times as much. So it seems like you don't have to shell out a lot of money to get a good quality blower. So my question is, do you leave fuel in your blower in the off season? And if you do, after watching this repair, would you keep doing it or start leaving the tank dry? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.